Hello everyone, today we make some general considerations about early medieval Europe and especially the development of the three major areas of power. That is essentially the Carolingian one, the Byzantine one and the Islamic one. Naturally this is a brutal approximation, as you can understand, because these weren't just the only powers existing in Europe, or at least some of them, especially the Islamic one, was essentially fragmented in several centers of power. There were other peoples that were essentially progressively forming their statal structures. Think about Eastern Europe, think about Northern Europe, and generally speaking, also think at the complexity existing, especially within the broader Carolingian Empire and the Frankish world of how it had come to be formed. The Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, if you prefer, but it's not really the proper say definition. Also, during this time, had a critical shrinking caused chiefly by the exhaustion that had followed, essentially the war and the destruction of Sassanid Persia, and that, as it's very well known, was exploited by the Arabs to essentially conquer huge parts of the Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean, from Spain to North Africa, Egypt, and Syrian Palestine, and stretching up to India. So creating this domain that, although obviously not expanding just in Byzantine lands, I mean they encompass the same Sassanid Persia in practice. Or what was left of it, at least from a political point of view, had, we can't say really started also because of the decline or the structural weakness of the Roman state in that crucial first half of the 7th century, and things could have gone otherwise. This is what I'm stressing from some time, especially in my videos. I really prefer, rather than giving you structural opinions about structuralistic opinions about how things had to go, which is would be very controversial. I like to stress how things could have really taken another turn, even if certain great individual figures sometimes had not existed. Think about, I don't know, if Charlemagne had not existed, or Muhammad had not existed. I mean, the whole world would have been very different today than what it is. We can say whether for better or for worse, unfortunately, but it's useful for us to understand history in the measure we know the world doesn't have a unique direction, and therefore the moment into which we are now is the quite random result, say, of certain causes that could have been really very, very different in origin. And this is very important, because if you look at history not just as a way to know the past as a kind of a thing that lays there with no importance, you understand that it's a way to be more responsible, actually, when looking at history as a whole, and especially thinking about our future, so that we know that things can go differently if we don't act, sometimes even personally speaking. So we're not all Charlemagne, indeed, but all what we do does have an influence and can have a radical impact on the history of the world. So we'll contribute. I mean, none of us, in different measure, will make that. And although there are greater reasons, greater causes that seem to be overwhelming, imposing, and fundamentally unavoidable, telling the truth, this is true from a strictly individual perspective. I mean, not everybody can radically change the world. As a matter of fact, almost nobody does. But we still have that portion of influence that can have on our families, our friends, our working place. Even with Schwerpunkt, I guess there is someone here listening to me. Probably I change something with things I say, not because I I enlight people so that they start doing who knows what. And excuse me, I drink a little bit. but rather because I can offer a different way of looking at the world, and surely make some change, hopefully for the best, since I don't think it's my personal achievement, but simply knowing history or thinking history, just reflecting on it and listening to different perspectives is something that works as a very powerful antidote against dogmatism, irrationality, and everything that can crystallize the world to the point that it's not able to cope with problems anymore. But whatever, this is just my little philosophical rant. Today, as I said before, I want really to draw certain essential lines, so I'm not going to go in detail with it. It's not going to be a story of any particular, not even any particular character objectively. We're going to stick to this broad, especially international dimension of Europe and the Mediterranean. So first of all, recently I discussed in some other videos, especially talking about the Eastern Roman Empire, how important, what the reasons were for the division of Western and Eastern Europe. I never liked these approximations, these sharp cuts, like as if Europe was split in two, either Northern or Southern Europe or Western Eastern Europe. I don't think it works like that. Surely there are certain factors, certain also certain macroscopical evidence for which, of course, there are different worlds. I think the latitude definitely changes, the climate, the environment, the settlement, many things. Even culture is, the West was more Latin, while the East was more Hellenic, essentially, at least if we stick to a strictly linguistical thing, because also naturally there weren't things at this point like the Latins or the Greeks or not even the Germans as such. I mean, Europe at this time was already pretty blended in, and at the same time, such identities of the Indo-European branch had formed because from the fusion, the blending of certain cultures within others, so it's extremely complicated. Definitely the Roman Empire had made a big deal of difference into this. Not just that, also Hellenistic civilization, etc. But I'm not gonna go so back in time. Just sticking to the end of the Roman Empire, thinking how these two areas of the continent between West and East, more or less, were differentiating. There were many reasons also in here. I won't repeat them. I kind of discussed them. If you go into especially the Byzantine history playlist, I made a bit of a consideration, so you can find scattered here and there. You can choose actually whichever video you prefer. There is the one I made recently. Maybe it can be more useful. Roman East in the 5th, 6th century, or Theodosius and the Choice of the East. I think it's another one that deals essentially with the reasons of the splitting of Western and Eastern Europe. What I stressed also recently, especially when discussing the history of the Franks, that is this other crucial chapter into early medieval, but also in late antique times, because the roots also in part naturally are very important. What you see is that, albeit the Western half of the Roman Empire had ceased to exist, let's say better, not fallen, because it's a bit too dramatic indeed. In 476 AD, practically nothing happened. Nobody ever even probably thought of what was going on as a crucial watershed in history. But the most important thing is also in here, and that's why I don't like the idea of the fall of the Roman Empire. First of all, as we know, the Roman Empire didn't fall until the 15th century, de facto, and but especially it's the imperial, the concept of the political period of the empire, of the imperium proper, of what it meant in a broad sense, and also at the same time in a narrower one. Kind of remained floating in there. I mean, even when the western half of the empire fell, sometimes people think it as a sectorial thing, like, oh well, yeah, the Roman Empire finished, the Middle Ages started, there was nothing more there about that. Obviously, it is not true. Most medievals indeed believed to live in the Roman Empire still in even much later than this. There was a very strong because that was not the Roman Empire as such, that it was really the empire, and all the populations, even those who had not been directly dominated by the Romans back in the day, had kind of absorbed this concept of the empire. It was something greater than we imagine today. Our minds polarizes as if we were reasoning on a 19th century national state perspective. The Roman Empire was just a competitor with other populations, and, when it ended, other populations kind of founded their own thing. Actually not. And especially the Germans, that obviously, in the East the Roman Empire continued. So and continued also for much of, for like a century and a half. Also they followed the Western Roman Empire to be actually very present also in Western Europe. But the Germans, or these, say, Germanic populations, as you want to call them, as well as others, telling the truth. Even in North Africa there was a certain attitude like this. There were also in here several there were several peoples coming literally from everywhere at this point, gravitating around the Roman Empire, including Slavs, including Turkic populations, etc. That kind of absorbed very strongly the concept of the empire, so that they, when the eventually, especially with the Arab invasions, the Constantinople basically for centuries ceased to have a far reach over Western Europe. The people who inhabited there, so in this Romano-Germanic or Latin-Germanic Europe, as you want to call it, kept pretty much in mind what the empire had been and was being still at that time. So that actually the concept of the empire entailed a broader meaning that was really transcendental. It was something that pertained, first of all, to the divinity, whichever it was, because at this point, in early medieval times, naturally, half of Europe was still pagan, the other was already Christian, but there were many hybrids in this sense, also especially in terms of political theory, because everybody wanted to essentially, especially the aristocracies, the elites, as you want to call them, always tended to be very, paradoxically less traditionalist than the rest of the population, and absorb all the models that could fit into into their political models to strengthen their own authority over these populations that, in fact, otherwise up to that point had largely known a very low level of degree of centralization, and were just at this time kind of developing the way they did. Probably the most important process in this happened in France. It happened in Gaul, as it was still called at the time, but saying France meant as Francia, so the land of the Franks and the land of the Merovingian kingdom, and eventually also in the one of the Carolingian Empire. So also in here I made several videos. You can find both in the playlists called Carolingian Europe and Medieval France, that deal pretty much in detail, especially with Franks and Clovis, the Franks and Clovis and this construction. That there is a video that especially is very, gets to the point, at least relatively to this thing of how the Germans collected the legacy of the Western Roman Empire as very early in time. And that video is in the Franks and Clovis from Germany to Empire. In fact, I decided to name it in that fashion, but you can also look in the Frankish Merovingian kingdom and in others. But this is not the point. I always take some time to propagandate my own videos, because I realize I express sometimes not very easy concepts, at least I can be, obviously, I can suck at explaining, but sometimes these concepts are really difficult on their own. So when I kind of went more in depth to them, and just to make you understand better what I'm talking about, I'm telling you to keep at least that I have explained this in other videos. So naturally, I have the interest for you to click and watch my videos, but when I'm speaking in here, it's really for the sake of explaining myself more than else, because sometimes I get certain comments that I wonder, what the hell these people have understood from what I said, because I realize might be my problem as well, not just the other people interested in kind of fantasizing about what they wish they heard, which happens still, by the way. Just for saying, it's a very deep general considerations. I make videos like this, telling the truth, because I more or less I do half of the videos about strictly military history, and the other ones are these broad, even introductory reflections on the on medieval history, especially at this point. I'm sticking to that, but I think paradox. I mean, I'm a military historian. At least I wish I had this. It's the kind of most the model of historian I mostly resemble to, given the things I study, at least at this moment, which I rarely discuss on my channel, telling the truth. And I love military history. It's simply, we are all experts and amateurs at the same time, and depending on what we have read, we have studied, etc. And this is also the beauty of having a dialogue, because everybody can bring something interesting in others have not thought about. But especially when I'm discussing these broad general topics, I'm searching to really make a strong point. I mean, not forcing certain interpretations rather than others, but trying to make people look at the whole thing. Because it's very easy to go, let's say, on Wikipedia, there's nothing really wrong with that, as long as you back it with other more substantial information, and start learning about, I don't know, this and that. Sometimes when I prepare videos, I also necessarily use Wikipedia, because you have this, at least if you don't remember a date or you don't remember a name, you haven't that. I have the problem also of translating from my native tongue to into English, so I always go look at that. But Wikipedia is very analytical. I mean, it's meant to actually English Wikipedia is not that bad in relatively to history. It also offers broader varieties. It's very well concise. It kind of gets a good synthesis of the bigger thing. It doesn't always get it particularly right. It doesn't say everything. But I mean, it's very easy to go there and pick certain thing. But sometimes history goes beyond maybe that date and that name, or that strictly regional perspective. What I would like mostly to stress is that the history of the world has always been kind of global in many ways. So you can't really study. I know there are people who are very selective. Like they like, I don't know, the Carolingian Empire. They like the Byzantine Empire, they like, I don't know, some Islamic power. They just stick to that. And they don't see everything, anything else, because, I don't know, maybe those single powers are their heroes, and they need to say, I only want to know about this. But you can't do it like this in history. It doesn't make any sense. You have to look at the whole picture, because otherwise you can't understand not even the things you are learning about that specific population. So sometimes I know I'm too vague, or at least I approximate brutally, because these are concepts that have been scoped really at a macroscopic level. If you go look into a catalog of the bibliography that exists on these topics, you kind of get crazy. But that's what I'm trying to do on Schwerpunkt, to get it kind of simpler, as far as I know, because I have my limits as well, and trying to stimulate some reflection. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So the point I was making is that essentially especially the Germanic populations who went to settle into the lands of the western, of the former lands of the Western Roman Empire, a bit everywhere really developed this kind of imperialistic thoughts. As we said now, the central role was definitely played by the Franks, because they were the greatest continental power in Western Europe, at least at the time. It's really a matter of sheer quantity. I mean, the Franks were really something huge, a matter of resources. They controlled huge fertile plains that up to that point had been controlled by the Romans. These Atlantic plains stretching from Spain to Denmark, essentially. And think about all the resources that they had. France has always been this enormous pool of agricultural resources that at this point were essentially what made everything, every kind of nation, every kind of state working at the time. But there were also other imperialistic stands that you can observe, especially in Visigothic Spain before falling to the Arabs. The Visigoths were developing a telling the truth that they weren't this the Visigothic kingdom went progressively weakening, also in terms of centralization, because the Visigothic monarchy at the beginning was kind of functional. They always had huge problems to control the Iberian Peninsula. That, by the way, was also pretty big if you think about it, pretty diverse, both in also in their climate, in population, in languages, and so on. But they were essentially copying the Byzantine models at that point in terms of imperial dignity, also the centrality of the Toledo councils into the Western Christendom. I mean, at a certain point, Spain was even in competition with Rome, with Italy as the center of Western church in part. Even in Anglo-Saxon England was definitely one of the least Romanized of the Latin-Germanic Europe, we can't say it. It was a few of Latin in there, but obviously also Britain had been Romanized to a certain extent, especially in certain areas. That was not really a few. You find titles, I mean, back in the mists of, I don't know, the 7th, the 8th century, like, that were attributed to to Anglo-Saxon kings. There were things like Basileus, that is essentially the imperial title in Greek, so not even in Latin. So these guys were looking straight at Constantinople and saying, okay, that's still the model. And this allegedly when the German populations had taken over, because the idea was that there was an empire still there, and that whichever it was not an empire like all the others. It was the universal empire, incidentally the Christian empire. And I don't know how much has been written really about this. I know this is actually an interesting frontier for academic research, but really stressing the idea that doesn't matter how much the Roman Empire had shrunk, contracted, especially after the Arab invasions, but the imperial authority of Rome, let's say, meant as the Roman Empire, was still alive. And the Germans that were ruling in the West weren't actually, first of all, they got heavily Romanized as well, especially in lands like Italy or Spain, but they also kept in mind this imperial model, saying we want to essentially fit into that, and not just because obviously these powers were surely not eager to to be part of someone else's empire, but more simply because they wanted to create an empire on their own. So this was extremely difficult because Latin-Germanic Europe was very slow, was there's this time of contraction, of crisis, if you want. Um, then even restarting Western Europe in terms of growth, etc., was something that took really a freaking long time. Then there were other powers that were completely positive, but they're a bit of an exception to imperial models. For instance, the Longobards. The Longobards never bought into the imperial thing. They kind of remained Germanic in mindset at the highest level. They got Romanized a lot, culturally speaking, as well, but they never needed to transform their kingdom into something different. It was from the kingdom of the Longobards. They always they always stuck to the Germanic ideal of freemen, and they had brought from Central Europe after when they had migrated into the Apennine Peninsula. There were other populations scattering there that, however, at this point were increasingly that had remained, for instance, usually detached from the Mediterranean since their origin, still surely being influenced by the Roman Empire. The Germans had even previously than coming into Western Europe, into Southern Europe, they were heavily Romanized. The empire was just next door. The Romans de facto controlled them up to a certain point. I mean, there was a lot of also of commercial penetration, was a lot of material culture. You can see it easily. Take a late Roman army, how the Germanic peoples and the Roman legionaries were actually pretty similar, also in equipment and all. And that is really a functional thing. It has not to do with the barbarization of the Roman army or the Romanization of the barbarians. It's really that this hybrid is something highly functional. Even the Romans of the early empire were using essentially or mostly Celtic-derived weaponry, but this definitely doesn't make them a Celtic power, and doesn't make the success of Rome this accomplishment of the Celts. The same goes for the Germans. The Germans kind of, they also were Celticized pretty heavily. They also adopted things like this pathe, the shields, the horned, the oval shields, the Celtic horn saddle. I mean, when you talk about material culture, it's really something that has no color, no nation. As long as it works, you take it. And telling the truth, the more you take and the more you prove telling the truth to be advanced. It's not that you take things for more advanced peoples and therefore it's their accomplishment. Because in order to integrate certain elements, you already have to be predisposed in a certain way. So it's sometimes amazing how these populations had remained opened to this broad system, and especially in early medieval times, with the evangelization, that is essentially how Rome, if you want, or Christianity, well, of course, in more specifically, but kind of kept making these peoples gravitating around that culture. I mean, yes, the Roman Empire had finished, but let's be honest about it. The southern European lands were keeping to essentially emanate this, this cultural and irradiate this cultural influence all over Europe, and that's how certain models were exported also in lands that had not known them. And we're talking also about urbanization. Christianity really gave a great impulse to that, because at least in continental Europe, the model of the diocese was based on a city center. So that obviously there were still Roman cities in many parts of Europe, but other cities were created at this time through also the process of expansion of political and military powers, chiefly the Carolingian, but also creating dioceses in there into the cities, and this meant also building certain structures in stone. It might sound strange, but even churches at this point were kind of a patrimonial good. They could be a fortress, they could be something greater. I mean, everything that was built in stone arguably at this time could turn into something strategical indeed, and definitely the church contributed to the strategic control of certain areas, especially in the Carolingian Empire, but pretty much everywhere. Mm. If you look at Romano-Germanic Europe, the church is always, first of all, it was already from the fall of the Roman Empire kind of the administrator of the local thing, business, in terms of civil thing, especially in the cities. They were kept being making work by the bishops, etc. And also the Germanic elites needed the Roman or Romanized elites to rule the territory, and this bond, in fact, not surprisingly, the strongest in the Frankish Empire, because the Franks came to rule over a very intensely Romanized land. It was Gaul, where the senatorial elites that made up also the highest echelons of the local clergy were extremely powerful, and they absolutely needed to be. The Franks needed them to side with them, so they could, and that's the reason why the Franks, for instance, never passed through things like Arianism. They switched directly from paganism to Catholicism, because that was a very powerful slogan to say, okay, now we have to be fully accepted by these locals because it's the only way we can control. And you can argue that possibly the success of the Franks that here is due, I would say, almost completely to the Merovingian dynasty. Was something, in fact, could have not happened. I mean, if also here, as we were saying before, if there had not been a figure like Clovis, and he had been killed in some battle, he had been slaughtered in some way, the Franks might have been just another small or medium-sized Romano-Germanic kingdom, and it could have coexisted together, I don't know, in fighting presumably, but always competitions with powers like the Burgundians or the Alemanni that weren't this huge thing, but really what Clovis managed to achieve in the Gauls was something that changed really the history of the world forever. So when we look at a bit later times like the 9th century, so at this time when the Carolingian Empire was born, we see essentially the ultimate consequence of a very long-term process that entailed a great deal of intense relation between the Roman and the Germanic world in early medieval times. This happened definitely through the, I would say chiefly through the process of evangelization. This is very important to bear in mind because Rome, meant as Papal Rome at this point, that is difficultly definable like this at this time, just as Papal Rome, but de facto we can't even start to conceive it in these terms, carried out this work of formally of evangelization, but it was something much greater, because evangelization basically entailed the control over all the, not really all, but at least of the ecclesiastical systematization all over Western Europe. Rome had always enjoyed, especially in the West, a huge moral and spiritual dignity and authority. At this time, as we were saying before, there was no thing like after the Gregorian reforms in the 11th and 12th century, the idea that Rome was the head of the church. Rome had been recognized back in the day of the Roman Empire, where the major dioceses of the world had been established, a first place in charity, the so-called charity. And definitely Rome had a huge prestige, I think already at the time of the relics, the burials of St. Peter and St. Paul. So it was obviously the greatest center of Christianity for real, because Rome was a true capital. It doesn't matter if the Western Roman Empire fell. If you see the cultural influence that Rome had as a city, singularly, over the whole Western Europe, in early medieval times, you realize what the popes were doing already at this point, where they formally didn't have the full control over the full juridical control they basically built up by themselves later over the city and other parts of Italy. They, however, had a huge moral impact all over the continent. At this time, I'm saying this because at this time, technically, up to a certain point, there were Byzantine garrisons in Rome up to I don't know when. I think in the 7th century we start losing the evidence of that, at least as a permanent garrison. Then Rome actually was military defended mostly by the so-called scholae, that were these corporations of foreigners that were incidentally created essentially for the sake of assisting the pilgrims of the various nationalities of Europe. There was the Schola Francorum, the Schola Saxonum, the Schola Langobardorum, etc. It was all these let's say ethnicities, the Longobards, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, etc. That there were people who were living in Rome at the time, together with other communities, because there was still a strong Greek community there, very ancient and old Jewish community as well. There were also Syrians after the especially the Arab invasions. There were lots of refugees from the Near East that instead of going to Constantinople, they went into Italy too, and this is something you can see also in early medieval Roman art and architecture. In Rome, there was a very strong influence of the Greek language as well. The Greek epigraphy in Rome is something you will still find up to very late. Then obviously the city remained still mostly a Latin, Italic, say, city, of course, but it was just right now, like back then, an extremely international center, and arguably it had always been since the beginning, and this witnesses, by the way, the importance that Rome had. I mean, this scholar, the presence of all these foreigners it had all over the world, in its moral prestige and everything. But more than else, what is important is how and by the way, the Byzantines tried obviously because Rome was formerly of the Roman Duchy of the Byzantine Empire. Eventually, now it doesn't make sense to go into details, but that Italy was formerly Byzantine up to a very at least certain areas, especially coastal areas, including Rome, were under, let's say, formally at least under the Byzantine control. Then, telling the truth, since the 7th century there had been a huge deal of centralization. Actually, there was a very osmotic process between the Longobard lands and one of the empire into the peninsula, but Rome in this sense was still looking at the east, because they still understood that Constantinople could come into her help sometimes, even though the popes already since this very even from the 6th century, especially when the Longobards arrived and eventually they managed to halt the Byzantine offensives aimed at wiping them out. The Pope really played very cleverly between these two powers. So leaning from one side from the Byzantines, from the Longobards, according to which in favor it would have been, and so they did when the Byzantines kind of were out of range, and the Longobards were about to take over the same Rome, although nothing dramatic in here. In Rome there was a pro-Longobard and an anti-Longobard faction. It's simply the anti-Longobard won. Also in here, huge different consequences that might have happened in history, and that's why they started looking at the Carolingians at that point and calling them into Italy to crush the Longobards. But telling the truth, the the very intense relation, especially between Rome and the Franks, it was something pretty early in time. The Franks had immediately a very strong bond with Rome. They understood that that was a pole of a political pole, not just a religious one, and they tried, even previously in Charlemagne's crowning in the year 800, um, to essentially stress their religious legitimization as a dynasty. We're talking about the Merovingians, because now I'm saying the Franks, but every time, just to make you understand, at this point the Franks were really not the people; they were really the dynasty of the Merovingians. This is the truth. I mean, the Merovingians had managed to create this essentially elitary and dynastic power that had taken over the Germanic freemen's view of how it would have been, differently from basically every other people, because no other Germanic population was able to create, nor able nor willing in certain cases, to create what the Merovingians did. The Merovingians, in order to legitimize their rule, they put together literally everything they could from an ideological point of view, and Rome played a crucial role into this. Now, also extremely important is this axis that goes from Italy to France and to Britain and the British islands as a whole, let's say, including Ireland, in this whole process. As we all know, the evangelization of the early spread of Christianity, especially in Ireland, and then the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, was something extremely important that Rome coordinated pretty astonishingly well. Just think about what the communications could be in centuries like the time of Gregory the Great, like in the 6th or 7th century. Well, Rome managed to do that. Managed to organize a church. Managed to make Rome accepted as the leading church in a way or in another in the West. It was very common for the Anglo-Saxon nobility to, at the end of their lives, to go to pilgrimage to Rome, and eventually to come die in there. So the popes were building up an international net that was really building up a sort of new concept of community. Up to that point, it had been the Roman Empire that had more or less glued all these populations of Europe together. Now it was the church, and naturally, with very different means. The Romans had legions, and the church had the Bible, which is not a less powerful weapon, and obviously it's a very complicated story. Naturally, also in here, as I said before, it was chiefly a matter of the elites being essentially engaged into these ecclesiastical relations because they saw that as a further strengthening and legitimization of their rule. This didn't happen just in Francia; it happened also in England. It happened in a lot of other places, and in times and spaces that still were pretty much an hybrid between, Christianism and paganism. We don't have to assume Christianization is really, popped out from one day to another and someone converted and it finished there. There was a lot of syncresis. It was mostly the elite that were, formally Christian, and also exteriorly, and stressing that, but the rest of these peoples kind of remained. The rest of the people, remained maybe integrating Christianity in part, because from a polytheistic perspective there is nothing really weird of integrating another deity. And the problem is how they were imposed. There were certain missionaries that eventually were martyrized, let's say, as such, but that had went into certain pagan communities, started crashing their idols, their sanctuaries, and or building a Christian shrine over them, and that was something seen as. But in this sense, it doesn't have to be understood as a strictly religious matter. It was really a political one. Also because of the influence of certain Christian powers, like the the Franks were these. I mean, if you want to look at the at the struggle, also the struggle for evangelization in certain lands, etc. You don't have to make it firstly a matter of religious belief. Paganism was not so reactionary, so closed to new beliefs and something like that. On the contrary, it was mostly the Christian world that was, say, that as a monotheistic world didn't conceive the chance of integrating other deities. But it was something different. It was the idea of political expansion. You can't understand why the Saxons resisted sometimes so harshly to Christianization in Germany if you don't understand that went along with the Frankish conquest. So with the invasion from a foreign people in their own lands. I mean, it's very important to think about Denmark, for instance. Denmark Christianized back in the day because, first of all, it was they feared the let's say the Carolingian and Ottonian invasion. They so you can argue, I don't know how much did the Danish people remain pagan in pectore, let's say. Probably for a very long time. Probably even longer did the Swedes or the Norwegians, etc. But at the same time, it was a matter of political convenience. Denmark, especially, was the main powers among the, improperly saying the Viking ones. There is always this nuisance that these weren't properly Viking powers because Viking was an activity, not a state. But you can't say Scandinavian either because Denmark, the Jutland Peninsula, is not in Scandinavia, so how do you call them? It's a bit of a, say the northern countries, but this is also pretty approximate. You could make Britain or, the Baltic lands fitting in there too. But aside from this, what I mean is, you have to understand also this process of evangelization as an eminently political project, beyond the individual belief, because it's so easy. I mean, I think all the religious studies show us that there were wide areas of Europe that, albeit in name Christian, remained de facto pagan for even well far into the modern age. So, and that has nothing even to do with something strictly geographical. I mean, of the distance from the physical distance from the centers of Christianity. That could have happened really next door, even to Rome and stuff like that. It was normal. There were traditions, especially in the countryside, where arguably, the life had always and was remaining the same, so that there was less need for change. But in the upper echelons of society at this point, Europe was really quite slowly but quite firmly transforming into something different, and the states, let's say, that were being formed into the Middle Ages were something amazing, telling the truth. Also in their synthesis from Roman, Germanic, and Christian models, chiefly. Also, there were also other influences, of course, Slavic, Turkic influence as well. But it's amazing because these populations up to that point had not been like that. Central and Eastern Europe had remained. There was a very up to that point there had been a very low degree of centralization, and you see that this progressive strengthening also of the political of the states of the aristocracies passed through the process of Christianization, and there were many interests also, like relative to trade, for instance. There was a great competition at this point between, for instance, Rome and Constantinople. They were to win over the Slavic populations, or other, say, even not properly Slavic populations like the Hungarians. They're largely kind of Slavic, but they have something different more. Just look at the language that is not Slavic. But let's say this Eastern world. Hmm? And this is something went on actually for even longer than the same empire. I mean, countries like, I don't know, like Poland, like Bohemia, like Hungary, I mean, were warned to the west essentially. The Russians stuck to the east. The Bulgarians stuck to the east. A country like Lithuania, also back in the, in such a late time like the 14th century, was still pagan formally. That it's kind of interesting. Also in there you can't think because nobody had reached them. There had been no missionaries or no. That was simply a political choice of a consistent power that decided to remain like that for political reasons. There was a time into which Lithuania was undecided whether to join, with the Russians or with the Poles. Eventually, they decided to join with the Poles, and that's also something that changed massively the history of Eastern Europe in that case. So many, really many, many dimensions that existed in this process, and the result of this, however, this is the point I wanted ultimately to make since the beginning, is that this developed in the West essentially the duplication of the Roman imperial dignity. And we're not talking about the Western Roman Empire. It was still the Roman Empire proper. We're not talking about Charlemagne. This is also a very hotly debated topic. There are the people who want to stress that there was just the true Roman Empire in the East that had survived. There are people who want to say no, because the Carolingians kind of won it with their arms, so it was God's will, and the Pope had the spiritual authority. I tendentially lean much more towards the legalistic reasons of Constantinople, because indeed by Roman right nobody can appoint another emperor if not the emperor himself. And that's why, by the way, the same Germans during the Middle Ages tried constantly to be recognized by Constantinople as peers of the Roman emperors, and the Roman emperors, sometimes got allied. There were also kind of royal marriages and etc., but they never ever recognized the Westerners as emperors, as peers. They called them something like kings of the Germans, which was an insult, by the way, because obviously those, the Germans believed at that point that they were true emperors. But I must say, at the same time, especially recently, I'm really, especially from a cultural and religious perspective, I'm vastly re-evaluating the idea of, let's say, the imperial ideology was built in the West as a continuity that the Germans, as conquerors, felt between the Roman imperial dignity and their own right of conquest. So that they said, now that, by the way, they had also converted to Christianity, that essentially we won, as Germanic populations, our empire, the empire, not our empire, the empire of God, the empire of Rome, by our military prowess. And the fact that legitimizes us is that we are the ones who actually have the imperium. Because if you look at the origins of the same Roman Empire, that was the story. The imperium was not something. The Roman Empire was never actually a Roman Empire. There's never been an entity that was called Roman Empire. Never. The empire was technically the imperium. It was this, essentially, approximating this authoritative command of dominion that the Romans had. It was actually conferred also for leading the armies to certain, like the consuls or other Roman magistrates, to lead the army to wage war in this sense. It was something strictly religiously meant, that equated into the Aryan mentality to the idea that the empire was given just by, it's not an institutional thing, it's actually the military glory, it's actually the power that you have. And we often forget this because we like to secularize and to modernize the Roman Empire, which has never been anything like that. And if you look at, in fact, in an early medieval perspective, you realize, especially if you had the mindset of a German that came from this world dominated by these Aryan conceptions of that he who wins has the power of God. Point. There is no way out of that, because military glory doesn't come but from the deity, and it's not human. So if these guys had won over the same lands of the empire, well, that was a sign that God had given the empire to them, because the empire is not a title, the empire is the actual power you have. So this perspective, actually, it was obviously, at the times, I don't know, the Carolingians of the Ottonians had been, say, rationalized, because they obviously understood that what had happened with the papal crowning of the emperor and all this thing was kind of, I don't know how to say it, pretty hazardous as a legitimating factor. But they felt that. I mean, if you read certain sources, like, for instance, Liutprand of Cremona was incidentally writing for the Ottonians at the time in anti-Byzantine fashion. There were certain passages, certain quotes that say this explicitly. I mean, even Liutprand of Cremona, de facto, was, he was a, he conceived, he was living in northern Italy. He considered himself a German, a Longbard, and he completely fitted, obviously this was part of the Ottonian propaganda as well, I mean, this idea that into the idea that the Germans were kind of a better stock, even, because he starts criticizing, even this is kind of sneaky and blurry, and it would take, maybe one day I will make a video dedicated to that, but essentially was saying that the Romans had lost the empire because they were a stock of degenerates. And he was stressing the old Germanic cliche that all the conquered people were essentially inferior to the conquerors, by saying, and he states, when this allegedly referring to the Byzantine emperor, when we want to say, we want to insult someone, we call him, "Oh, you Roman," as saying, look, that we as Germans, we won over you, we took the empire that you were not able to maintain. And obviously it's very difficult to be in the mindset of a 9th century or 10th century average no one that existed at the time, about which we don't know anything, telling the truth. But we can probably guess that such beliefs were still pretty much rooted in a world that was still very close to those origins, telling the truth, because even if you look, for instance, we made the case of the Longobards now in Italy. In Italy, have you ever wondered, for instance, why the Longobards remain kind of completely detached from any imperial ideal, up to at least when they were conquered by the Carolingians, who enforced then obviously the imperial idea that the Merovingians and the Carolingians had built into Francia as an exception also for the Germanic world. But it's obvious that mentality had remained there because the Roman society as such had been wiped out. I mean, the idea of the senators, of the large estate owners, had completely melted in Italy. So even the average Romanized Italic population was perfectly fine with Germanic models at that point, and they joined into this kind of Germanship from a juridical point of view, at the point that you have a guy like Liutprand from Cremona who considered himself even a German, ideally. This is very important also from a juridical point of view, because at that time we don't have to mean it this in a kind of a narrowly ethnical way, like who you were descending from. You have to mean it also from a juridical point of view. You have a certain nationality meant in the Roman way, that it was the one that was perceived at the time. That is not the idea of modern nation, of course, but the natio or natio, so the idea of where you were born, actually. So it's something even different from the fatherland, the patria. That is a different thing as well. This was felt because you were say, a Longobard, a Frank, a Saxon, a Burgundian, whatever. If you were essentially, if you had that specific Longobard, Frankish, Saxon, Burgundian right, because at that time the subjects were framed that way. When the Carolingians reconquered at least great parts of Europe, they obviously didn't impose Frankish right. It wasn't conceived at the time. I mean, the Romans as a state would have imposed their own right over the other populations, and obviously trying always, it was not so heavy, so imposing, but the idea was at that point that everybody that was a Christian essentially could fit into the empire. Also the Jews, telling the truth, because the Jews were the only ones, the only non-Christian community that, since had something in common with the Christians, religiously speaking, was meant to be the witness of the new coming of Christ at the end of times. So to say, look, to have someone you could tell, look, I told you that was what we were right. But getting back to Carolingians, they didn't obviously impose their own right, because the Germans were perfectly aware that every community had its own right. They had this kind of federal ideal. The Carolingians not so much, because they had more of an imperial ideal, but in political and juridical practice they stuck to the idea that, fine, I don't know, you conquered Saxony, you conquered Longobardy, and the local people can still use the Saxon right, you can use the Longobard right, and this thing went on. And it's actually something pretty advanced, theoretically speaking. It's one of those things that the Germans added to the, let's say, to the European culture that still kind of, it was wiped out by the nation state, to be honest, because the nation state imposed that everybody has to be equal in some. But if you see even, in today's, I don't know, German juridical system, there is still the idea that every land is a state on its own, and that there is a constitution that is in common, and a hierarchy of different laws that are more or less equal, and then there is, however, a local right that is kind of the local community. This is a typically Germanic. It really stems from the Holy Roman Empire, conceptually speaking. So this is another digression. I think it's interesting to discuss about this. So now we said it, the Carolingians retake after the decline of the Merovingians, etc., this huge empire, and they marry with Papal Rome, essentially, in this relationship that lasts forever, was extremely tormented, as we know, as medievalists, but that nevertheless lived on. It never came over. So you see it in the Holy Roman Empire. Excuse me, I was not getting moved, I just had to cough. It remained actually quite strongly in as a legitimizing factor of the same empire. So I made another video that says similar things to this one, albeit in a different way. That is, I don't remember why it was going. It was at the roots of the Renovatio Imperii, something like that. It was slightly different actually in content now. We will actually even differentiate it even more. But that can be interesting to stress these other points a little bit. Excuse me, I drink once again. So there was a pretty strong relation, since even before the Carolingians, it was now reinforced. It was something very old before the between the Frankish world and the Italic-Roman world. This was very important for essentially also for stressing the naturally the Romanization of the same Carolingian Empire was felt by the same Franks at a certain point as pretty backwards in many ways, in the sense, especially the Carolingians took very seriously the fitness of the Frankish church, of the Frankish clergy that at that time wasn't very very evolved. Let's say that they hardly knew how even to read Latin, so can imagine how they could understand the Bible and so on. So the Carolingians actually did a lot of that, but it was also a matter probably of strictly political and juridical organization. The Carolingians definitely, when they arrived in Italy, they found a world that was extremely different from their own, and they were especially very interested by what the Longobards had achieved on the wake of the Roman administration. I mean, not really on the wake of the Roman administration, but in a say of a process of Romanization that entailed the adoption of the concept of public authority that then the Franks didn't really have, at least as strongly as the Longobards, who achieved to, by the way, stress that even remaining essentially a fully Germanic power. So, and also naturally by the fitness of take the spring of the Roman model from Papal Rome itself. So this axis was extremely important because eventually it had to become also the Carolingians didn't conquer the whole Italian peninsula. They arrived essentially up to central and parts of southern Italy, sometimes chiefly central Italy. So that Rome was included into the empire. It still pertained. I mean, the local, papal prerogatives were still intact. At least the Carolingians and other emperors later in time never made it to take them away from the papacy that kind of regenerated its own prerogatives over time. It actually never gave them up. But it was also important because southern Italy was much closer instead to the Roman Empire. There were still Byzantine lands in there. So now eventually the ones who wiped them out were the Normans, that in this sense had nothing to do with the Holy Roman Empire. And but that's even another story now. How was this possible? I mean, were there certain factors that really some extra factors that brought the Franks to emerge as this Western counterpart in terms of imperial dignity? Well, surely yes, there were, and the answer has to be really looked at the Arab invasions, indeed, at least in a broad political spectrum, in the sense that, as we said before, the Eastern, the Roman Empire in the East had managed to, at a certain point, even seize great parts of the Western Mediterranean in the 6th century with Justinian in his Reconquest, and then at this point had actually a pretty massive influence. It arrived even at the outskirts of the Frankish world, like southern Gaul was still minting imperial coins back in the day, even if we don't have any evidence of, I think, Byzantine garrisons there. So it was still a moment in which the same Franks looked at the Byzantine Empire, said, okay, this is still here. And then actually, if let's imagine now in this period between the Justinian Reconquest and the Arab invasions, if the Longobards had not arrived into Italy, so really dividing once again the Merovingian Gaul and the Roman Empire, it's very likely that the Franks would have actually began probably to stress, even at that point, their own kind of imperial dignity as essentially a counter, I don't know how to say that, as an alternative to the Eastern one. This is actually pretty blurry because by that time the Franks also had lots of problems of their own. They were still fitting in this kind of obedient, you know, frame of towards the Roman Empire. But even if you see at the end of the Greek-Gothic War, the Franks and the Alemanni launched certain incursions into Byzantine Italy, even up to the south of the peninsula. So there were already attritions that eventually were kind of prevented just because the Longobards arrived and made the Franks and the Byzantines allies once again against this, how they had been essentially against the Goths. And I made a video about this in the video 6th century balance of power, Goths versus the Franks in Constantinople, that separated these powers forever. Then the Arabs arrived sometime later, more than some time later actually. In the meanwhile, also now there were the Longobards in Italy, but even the the Merovingians were starting to have certain problems on their own in Gaul, so they began to split up. Also in here, that was the plague in Europe, so there was also in there a contraction a bit everywhere of the local society in some way. So these powers kind of froze a little bit. Up to the first half of the 6th century, they had been kind of still dynamic powers. I mean, late antique culture and potential was still pretty much alive. Then, for the second half of the 6th century, this contraction arrives, and also the kind of the migration era finishes at a certain point, especially into Western Europe. So we can say that up to that point, there was no chance for the Merovingians at that point to reclaim their imperial prerogatives, or not to stress them. I mean, they had a huge reason to stress them again. Yet the Franks were mindful of having been invested of the vicariate of the Gauls by the same Romans. There was actually a lot of also in here especially the bond between the local Roman Church and the Merovingian dynasty was being strengthened in this monarchic perspective. This idea that France kind of always remained with. I mean, the idea that France comes before everything else. It was the idea in every time. It was like that in the Middle Ages. It was like that during the modern age. Arguably also in contemporary history, in spite of all the defeats it suffered eventually also against the, say, renewed German Empire in a certain sense. But it's always been like that, because from the Franks, France always always had clearly in mind that they had to be the hegemonic power into Western Europe, point. And that's what they've always been trying to do. It started here, because it was not just an idea that someone invented, because naturally everyone at that point wanted to expand. It's that in France were all these factors that during the Merovingian and Carolingian times brought to the idea that were somehow better than the others, they were somehow special, they were favored by God, and so on. It was stressed very, very much, especially during Carolingian times. And I'm talking about France, knowing that there is nothing like France at this time, but really thinking it as, especially from a structural point of view, as France as a major power from a geographical point of view. Because, excuse me, I settled one thing here. Especially northern France, in spite of what could have happened in at certain times of history could have also not existed, but it always remained. I mean, especially this idea of the Neustria that had been the Western Francia, it remained as a center of power from which the same France eventually evolved, albeit with some important transformations, but essentially remaining that core, that idea, the marriage between the local church, Saint-Denis, Rheims, the holy anointing of Frankish kings at the time. So it is how it happened. But the real turning point at this point were the Arab invasions. And why? Because those basically shrunk the Byzantine power towards the east. As we said, there were still Byzantine lands into Italy up to very late in the High Middle Ages, but these were highly decentralized, and the Roman Empire managed at times to re-expand consistently and trying even to re-enter into Italy. There was definitely warfare going on in Carolingian times, in Ottonian times, also up to the 12th century actually. These efforts to attack Italy, and also continuous intervention, also backing certain powers to for instance, against the Angevins, the Byzantines backed the Aragonese. So there was a lot of causing for the Sicilian Vespers, and also it is a situation that goes really. It's a matter of areas of influence. But in the 7th century, the empire shrinks, Islam advances, and there is a huge change in the balance of power. So the Franks got this opportunity now that the Longobard kingdom had grown weaker. The Byzantines were kind of now that we're actually re-expanding at the end of the 8th century, but they were still, much less powerful they had been before, let's say in the 6th century. So they take this chance of seizing finally the Italian peninsula, or a great part of it, and to recreate this kind of Western empire that had naturally different points of balance, centers of power, etc., but that would originate essentially the Holy Roman Empire and remaining in this sense as the Western Empire, according to which perspective you prefer to be. But it was different. It was nothing like the western half of the Roman Empire that existed before. It was radically different. And in this sense, the Holy Roman Empire represents the perfectly, let's say, the hybrid between the Roman, Germanic, and Christian culture that existed in for the dynamics that had formed it in the West. So there are naturally many interpretations to this. Recently I began to discuss Piren's thesis that I'm actually no expert on, but it's pretty like shooting on the Red Cross today, because it's a very dated theory, and everybody criticized it just to show how I know historiography. Well, I never bothered myself to read. I've read something from of Piren, but I really don't like getting thoroughly into the historiographical perspective. I don't really know why. I'm not saying it's good. Don't take my example, but sometimes it happens the opposite. People, just follow the historiography, and then they don't look at the sources. They don't reflect autonomously. Historiography is very important because it gives you all these perspectives that are indeed that show you actually. Because the more I've been reading historiography, and the more I've realized that even certain authors that have been so criticized actually had got much of the whole thing right, and that we actually keep working on their own achievements. And sometimes you realize that also modern historiography is more concerned about itself, but saying, and their ideological pushes than what the one in the past was. I mean, it's obvious that you can't criticize Piren of late between. It was so old. So it obviously also historiography was less refined, it was another mindset, etc. But certain concepts, certain interpretations are not these hugely bad. So Pyrrhen, however, got it wrong in certain things, at least, and especially he wrote in 1937 the very famous work Muhammad and Charlemagne. Is one of the pillars of medieval historiography, and this perspective he exposed was completely debunked during the 20th century, especially because the idea was that essentially Pyrrhen's idea was that when Islam expanded into the Mediterranean, basically it split the Europe in split Europe in two by consequence. West and East, because West and East, according to Pyrrhen, were related mostly by a sort of trade net that, according to him, collapsed when the Arabs arrived, and because this was happening into the Mediterranean. So this is completely false, because the Arabs, on the contrary, stimulated trade. There was a contraction. It was definitely the breaking of the political unity of the Mediterranean, but not really a lesser contact between East and West as we imagine it. Especially in later times, you observe how the relation with the Muslim world and Europe were extremely fertile, culturally speaking. They benefited Europe from a cultural point of view in a massive way. There were wars, there was a lot of warfare and so on, but it was nothing that actually interrupted the exchange, the growth, and so on. On the long run, it's so evident, and it's not even worth to discuss it. Or maybe we will do it in another dedicated video, not just to pretend, not just to sound as if I knew better, and then I don't even explain what I believe. So Pyrrhen believed in the sense that everything started from trade, and he wanted to stress as the Arabs cut these traffics and they brought to the West and East to differentiate. But telling the truth, this process had already started since a very long time. When the Arabs arrived, it is true that certain areas stopped. There were other circuits more than else that were formed. Different powers that existed, in fact, from all over the Mediterranean. There were Muslim in religion from Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Syria, etc. These, first of all, shifted the trade, but if you look at what the Mediterranean trade had been before the Arabs, you realize that from the ancient times, this had hugely contracted. Pyrrhen was writing, that in 7th century Marseille there were still pottery that was brought from Greece, and after that, as if that was the proof of a non-stop continuous trade until the Arabs arrived. Telling the truth, it's not like that. By the way, the Arabs came to conquer also certain areas of certain areas of southern France, and these brought arguably also to the local Christian powers were sometimes even fine with that, because they were living out the outskirts of the Carolingian Empire at that point. They didn't like the Carolingians that much. They preferred to have these scattered Muslim lordships next door with which they could trade, because they in fact could grant them access to this broader Muslim trade that was developing in the Western Mediterranean as well, between Spain, Sicily, and so on. So according to Pyrrhen, this Arab invasion brought to the contraction not just of the East, but also of the West in itself, as if the medieval world closed it in itself for some reason. That the Carolingians, in this sense, were a consequence of the necessity of a rural empire. So not a trade empire like the Roman one, but now something centered just exclusively on agriculture. By the way, the Roman Empire was based on agriculture, and Roman trade was based on agriculture, because that was the base of everything at the time. So this interpretation is so very faulty in many ways. And the crisis and the decline of the activism and the structures that were traditionally tied to the prosperity of the cities of the Mediterranean had already began well before the Arab advance. But we can correct in part this thesis by saying essentially that paradoxically, it was the arrival of the Arabs that allowed the Franks to fill that gap that was left by the Byzantines in the West. This is the real point, and it's actually a very good interpretation, in my opinion. So, and this was obvious because the Byzantines now were dealing with a huge threat posed by the Islamic advance in the East. So they kind of also mentally conceive themselves as more on that side, geographically speaking. And the Franks now exploited this to expand into that same Mediterranean that the Byzantines had left. And the Carolingians weren't actually such a properly Mediterranean power, but they definitely invaded Italy. That is placed in this sense. They went towards Istria, also to the outskirts of the Byzantine Empire in practice. They dealt with the Arabs, that were definitely a Mediterranean power at that point, so they kind of started seizing this Western dimension, and definitely also their successors, including the Ottonians, and think especially about the Swabians a bit later, always searched for the Mediterranean adventure. I mean, the main objective, especially from Ottonian times onwards, was to control Italy, to eventually get into the East, because this was the point. This was the objective of all the Germanic emperors: taking Italy, taking Constantinople, and reuniting the whole Europe and the Mediterranean under the Roman Empire. It was the bigger scale thing, and believe me, they got very close to that, to achieving that. It's not something, they could have never done it. They were about to do that. If, I don't know, I think the Battle of Legnano was crucial into this, because after that the Swabian power kind of contracted, and it was still powerful. It could have still achieved something, but just if the Swabians had won a bunch of battles, it's very likely that by the 13th century we would have had, at least for some time, a unified, empire, with the Swabians ruling over Germany, over Rome, over Constantinople. And the center of the empire would have been definitely Rome. Let's not be the Swabians wanted to be. If you take Frederick II, his ideal was Rome as the center of the empire, Germany just a peripheral province. So this was the huge dream of the medieval empire. It was something that. Medieval empire. I am so Western centric. I know. Sorry about that. The whole Roman Empire, but it was arguably the dream of the empire in the first place, of whichever empire it had been. At least from a European and Mediterranean perspective, that's what you want to do. You want to control Europe. You want to control the Mediterranean. The Romans started it. There was some attempt into the Hellenistic times, but the Hellenistic powers were mostly concerned about India rather than Europe, as a priority at least. It's in medieval times that this occurs. The Byzantines tried it, the Germans, the Holy Roman Emperors tried it. it was actually a big dream that lived on up to the modern age. I mean, the Habsburgs under Charles V could aim at that, even if it was something very difficult. But the idea of the universal empire, which encompasses ideally and reunites the two halves, was pretty much like there. So I guess the point I was trying to make today is, if the Arabs' advance had not happened, the Franks might have not had the chance to expand in the West as much as they did. At least into Italy, at least into other surrounding lands, because the Byzantines might have objectively retaken part of those lands if the Arabs had not kicked in. This was perfectly feasible because the Roman Empire was a much more solid structure than the Carolingian one, or the Holy or Roman imperial one was, at least up to a certain point. Because also the Byzantine, also in here, we conceive the Byzantine Empire as a sort of monolithic block that had no transformations and all. But telling you the truth, they had their own crisis as well, and they kind of evolved in a similar fashion to the Western, can say to the Western Empire proper, because that's at that scale that you can't really see the difference. Because the Byzantine Empire was centralized at every time, the Western Empire wasn't. But in terms of of potential, of social, political and social, political and military powers, socio-economical dynamics. Also, the Byzantines lived seemingly very similar experience to the West, and this was due mostly to environmental factors. Then there were also some other political and social factors that brought to these empires to differentiate. Also religious factors. I mean, it was mostly a political thing at the base, and to eventually become sort of equal power. If you think about it, I really see hardly debated, for instance, on the YouTube there are these people killing each other to say, oh, this was stronger, this was not, but you really hardly see, first of all, in first place, someone discussing about medieval history. Secondly, someone trying to compare, in fact, the Western, say the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And it's painful because these were real powers. They weren't just fictional, especially when it goes to the Holy Roman Empire. People say, oh, that this wasn't really so strong, it was a joke and all that stuff. Telling you the truth, it's not really that. I mean, it was just a different form. It was, surely a very different thing institutionally from the Byzantine Empire, but it definitely didn't come out as a less powerful thing. I mean, if you especially see under Frederick Barbarossa what the sheer weight of the Holy Roman Empire was all over, because it's what happened in Germany influenced everything, literally everything that was happening also in the Crusader states, into the Byzantine Empire, was all about that. And I hate this view of the Middle Ages as a place where warfare or politics work only at a sort of local scale, or that where people were, I don't know, there was no main project, was no functionality in these political structures. This is actually a modernistic prejudice, and also pretty easily to debunk. And I also don't like when people look at the Holy Roman Empire with sufficiency, saying, well, okay, it was just an impostor or something like that, because that's telling the truth. The Holy Roman Empire came out of a world of great effort to make things work. You don't have to underestimate the belief of these German rulers in really creating a Christian empire, a Roman empire, because, and it's all the more meaningful, in fact, because they had a German mentality, so they were very different. They were lightly Romanized. Instead, they took that extremely seriously. And it was surely a tough world. There was a lot of interest, a lot of selfishness, a lot of cynicism. But that happened literally everywhere. I mean, take Constantinople. They surely weren't. Hundreds of years spent trying to survive against all these avalanches of all the worst impossible enemies coming one after the other. The gates of Constantinople teaches you how to be sneaky and cold and all that stuff. But that's called realpolitik, and that's how the world actually works at all times, including today. So it's we have to be honest. I believe this is one of the most important things. When we look at history, we shouldn't judge it with idealistic or moralistic perspectives, because if you do that, you even miss the actual objectivity of history, and that's what we're arguably only trying to do with history, trying to be objective, trying to figure out not the truth, because the truth does exist. This is the problem. Truth always exists. The problem is it's very often too out of reach of our poor cognitive means. So we should better, but setting into the right direction is important. So I wouldn't feel myself to underestimate the Holy Roman Empire, because I know how that came from. There are so many people out there that think that the Middle Ages was a sort of stagnating, a dark hole where nothing happened and everything was kind of faulty and weak and nothing. But if you study the Middle Ages in detail, in depth, you see how much dynamism, how much intelligence, how much strength, how much power, how much need for creating something that worked. I believe, I don't know if I was influenced by my studies into this, but especially when you read laws, when you read, you understand there is an intelligence behind that. It's so pragmatic. This is our myth of the Middle Ages lost as a sort of romantic landscape where people were, because there is that other interpretation as well. The medieval fanboys that have to say that everything was, so ideal, so good, so pure, so this moment in which we should all live like they did in the Middle Ages. Well, okay, maybe you try. I don't want to have anything like that, but it's really the pragmatism that existed in here. It's really the effort to make a change from a real point of view. And the Middle Ages, in this sense, were so dynamic, were so original. This is probably the most difficult thing to understand. Also, this myth of the Renaissance, that it's as if the classical world re-emerged for some reason into the 16th century, as if nothing that happened in the middle had any meaning or merit for that. If you see what happened in the Renaissance, sometimes it was just a crystallized society that kind of tried to, let's say, envelope to pretend virtue, copying the Roman models. Was a sort of there was a lot of original synthesis in there. I don't want to talk all the time bad about the Renaissance, but what in medieval times was done was actually what put the basis for an original interpretation of the past. Also because the medievals had quite clear in mind, just like in the times of the Renaissance, that what had happened in the Roman Empire was the model. Well, it's not that the humanists invented anything new in this sense. In taking the classics back and all the medievals look at Rome, look at Greece, and said, okay, we have to, especially at Rome indeed, we have to take this we have to adapt it to our own needs. We have to make it work in our own society. They had paradoxically a much better perception of themselves than in later times our society had, arguably. And you see there the intelligence. When you see a model that is not just, copied and repeated, but actually interiorized, mediated, and reformulated, you see that that's civilization. And a medieval civilization has been enormous. Also in terms of in moral terms it was as well. They really made a radical change from the ancient world in terms of ethics, in terms of looking at the world. And that's what we have to look at, because all periods in times kind of sucked for some reason. So it's very easy to criticize everything or to praise, I don't know, and forgetting about those and praising on the contrary. Everybody's good at doing that. Everybody's good at, getting on the internet and writing, oh, these guys were better than others, and like that. Not everybody is able to look into detail and to say, okay, this is a world that made civilization, that was able to solve the problems using what they had at their own disposal and find the best solutions. So this is arguably what eventually humans do, because humans are quite adaptable, but there are times in history where, let's say, certain superstructural factors are a bit more challenging. Especially it's very difficult sometimes to make understand that more advanced societies are sometimes the ones that have more difficulty to change. Let's be honest, the ancient world collapsed. The medieval world did not collapse. Have you ever thought about it? This is important. And you start collapsing when you start sclerotizing. When you think you're superior, when you think you're better, when you think you always get it right, when you think you start to underestimate the others, that's when you lose it. Because then you're not able to respond anymore, to cope with that anymore. It's like a bit what happened into the Roman world. I mean, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, the Byzantine Empire was actually this perfect, extreme, brilliant synthesis between Hellenic intellectualism and Roman pragmatism. It was extraordinary. The Byzantines could look at all the enemies, studying them, learning from them, finding, re-elaborating new responses, dealing with them. This is how Constantinople made it to survive for centuries under, in fact, the attack of the worst imaginable enemies time after time, without even having time to breathe. But eventually, the situation kind of, especially towards the 12th century, I can't say, well, there is a lot of criticism also towards the Byzantines. I don't want to indulge in, because it's wrong. I love Byzantine history, and I don't fully buy the idea that the Byzantines actually sclerotized in themselves at the point of collapsing for that reason, because there were other powers that were kind of similar, and they didn't. But indeed, there was a mischance of transformation at a certain point. We can debate about, actually, because this is actually a very important topic of debate into Byzantinistics. And I think especially figures like Emmanuel Comnenus, that was a great emperor, telling the truth. He was a full Byzantine, of course, in mindset and all, but he was able to recognize that Westerners, for instance, were starting to do some things for which they were surpassing, in fact, in the 12th century, the Roman Empire in terms of dynamism of evolution. And he tried to push, arguably tried to push for this kind of feudalization on Western model of the empire, at least going towards that direction. He was in love with Western culture. He had lots of Westerners at his court and his army. There's a beautiful book by Magdalinov, as this American author. He wrote on Emmanuel Comnenus. Just read it, because that is beautiful, and actually deals in detail also with the international situation between the 12th and the 13th century. I mean the 12th century, sorry, and between also East and West. Makes you understand how powerful, for instance, the Swabians really were. How much the Byzantines still at that time there was the last invasion of Italy by the Byzantines. So that answers you some questions in that and can make you wonder, saying, well, was the Byzantine world really sclerotizing? Was there in there? You see, there was a sort of reaction. I mean, definitely the detractors of Emmanuel Comnenus looked at him as a sort of, I can say, of a degenerate, but I mean, the idea that he was leaning towards too much towards the Western models. And the defeat of Myriocephalon, the alleged defeat of Myriocephalon, and the whole situation is still very interpretable. But in that, it shows actually that even in a perfectly Roman emperor like him, there was this ability still so late in time to look at the other models, look at other perspectives, and trying to adapt them into the Roman Empire. So also in here, I don't want to stress at all the myth that the Byzantines simply sclerotize and fail. But it's indeed true that there was a point in which they kind of stopped intellectual superiority has this problem. And it's very easy to fall into the idea you're better than someone else because just you're more intelligent. Not always. Usually in war, especially, the more intelligent wins, but not always. And still, and obviously the Romans were extremely proud about their legacy, about their. But the world was changing, and the 12th century was arguably the last century into which the universalism really still fully worked, because already from the mid of the 13th century everything started to change. So it would have been very interesting to see what the Byzantine Empire would have been if it had survived. I mean, if in 1204 the Crusaders hadn't destroyed it, yeah, of course there were the other chunks of the empire that survived once again. They even retook Constantinople. It was never the same. Would have really been interesting to see what in the 13th century the Byzantine Empire would have done like. But even the same Crusader sack of 1204 actually tells you there was something wasn't going really well, because objectively the fault of 1204's sack was due to both to the Westerners and to the Byzantines themselves. I mean, the Byzantines called them there for their political intrigues of court and all, and they mismanaged. There was a mess happening within the same city walls during the siege that really made it. The Crusaders might have not taken the city after all. So it's maybe that's the answer. I don't like theologism, but maybe that's the response. That's how it had to go, or that's what shows really what would have happened, in fact. But anyway, I don't know why I pushed myself so far now. This was just a reflection on my own, and the I don't know. I could add else, but I can think of other ideas. I will surely discuss in the future how the Byzantines coped with the Islamic advance, which is also an extremely important chapter of medieval history, often overlooked. We think at battles like Poitiers in the West as if what they changed. Let's think about battles that occurred. The siege of Constantinople, of the Arabs, the Battle of Acroinos, etc. How many people do know about this? Surely there is some. I know that there's plenty of people who like Byzantine history, but the greater masses kind of still don't care. It's not that they don't know. They just don't want to reflect on it. I will try to do it on Schwerpunkt. So now I'm pretty tired as well. I just hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.